My talk this evening is going to be specifically about income inequality and two impacts related to that: impact on housing and an impact on health. So that's the focus for the talk. And the main book that I'm going to be referring to is this one, which some of you might have come across sometime in the last few years, called The Spirit Level. It's written about 5 or 6 years ago. It's actually easier to read than it looks, because there are so many charts in there that take up so much space that there isn't, that much reading really. You get through it in a couple of evenings. Fascinating book. I'll refer to that. Some of the charts I'll use have come from there. But a more recent book is this one by Danny Dorling, All That Is Solid, about housing. Fascinating book, came out just a few months ago. And I'm also going to refer to The Price of Inequality by Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz, that you may have come across. American author, American focus, has a lot to say about the UK though as well. So those three books. Now, I've got a number of slides, and some of the slides I'm just going to put up and let you read. Some of the slides are chart-based, and I'll explain those. And forgive me if I refer to my notes. I'll have my notes here to try and make sure that I don't confuse myself, because I'm not an economist. It doesn't come naturally to me talking about economic-related issues, and I don't want to confuse myself, otherwise I'll confuse you as well. So I'll do that. And there are, as I say, a couple of charts, and we've got copies to give you when we get to that point, so that you can actually scribble on the charts, so that you understand them. You make your own notes at that point. But obviously, if I say anything you don't understand, then stop me and I'll go through that again. Okay, what I want to start with is, dividing the room in two. Don't worry, you don't have to move, you don't have to say anything, just need to think a little bit differently perhaps. So I'm going to take a line right through the middle of this table and right through the middle of that table. So everybody this side, you're going to represent one group in the UK, and everybody this side, you're going to represent another group in the UK, just for the benefit of the first slide and one or two other slides later on, okay? Bear with me on this. Now this group over here, from here onwards, you're going to represent the wealthiest 20% in the UK. Okay, so that's your role for the next few minutes, 20%. Now, that's a lot of people. That's around about 12 to 13 million people that you're representing at the moment. So, okay, the very richest at one end will be in this group, and the not quite so rich, So that's the group you're representing just for the moment, okay? So hang on to that thought. Now, you're really lucky over here, because you're going to represent the poorest 20% in the UK, okay? Yeah, absolutely fine. So again, it's 12 to 13 million people, a lot of people, from the very poorest, at one end, sorry about that, to the not quite so poor, Now, what I want you to think about is, what's the relationship in terms of wealth between those two groups of people? What are the sort of the differences? So if, for example, we said, this group had £1, how many pounds would this group have on average? That's what I want you to think about, that balance between the two. Now, when the UK population was asked this question, what they came up with, in a fairly recent opinion poll, what they came up with was the number 4. They said that they felt that the poorest 20% compared to the richest 20% was about in the ratio of 1 to 4. So for every £1 this group had £4, for every one car this group had, and so on, that sort of thing. And they also said that they felt that was the case, but they felt that was fair. They recognised that there are going to be rich people and poor people in any country, but they felt that the ratio of 1 to 4 was a fair balance. So I want you to think about that. What is the ratio in the UK? And also think about something else. Think about developed countries. Let's say that the 20 or so most developed countries in the world. Is it the same? Or is there a difference? Okay, so that's what you've got in mind between these two groups of people. Okay, so here we go. This is it. Here's the UK, look. There. And it's 7.2. So for every £1 that this group has in the UK, this group has over 7. So that's the figure. Now there are some countries, look, over here, which are roughly 1 to 4, which remember the UK population said was fair. Japan and the Scandinavian countries have that relationship of about 1 to 4. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But just look at this end of the chart. Now, I'm going to refer to this end of the chart as the bad end, really, because this is the more unequal end of things. And you can see that the US is the most unequal country. So the top 20% are over 8 times richer, wealthier than the bottom 20% in the US. In the UK, 7.2, Scandinavian countries and Japan round about 4. And others in the middle, which you can see. So, there's a situation. The UK is almost twice the amount of fairness that people thought it was going to be. So that comes as a bit of a surprise to some people. So my next question really to myself is, let's start thinking, let's sort of dig a little bit deeper, and let's have a look at what's going on in terms of pay. Now, one of the problems that you've got when you start looking at these sort of stats is that it does take a while for the information to filter through. So 2011, you might say, well, that's quite a long time ago, but by the time this stuff is analysed and comes out, you usually get an 18-month to 2-year lag. So, and the other point is, things haven't changed that much, really, in the last 2 or 3 years. So what this chart represents is a number of different jobs, if you like. Don't worry about the numbers across the bottom. That doesn't relate to pounds, because obviously prime ministers pay, 180,000, something like that? Prime minister? Yeah, 175, 180,000. So that's what that represents there. And obviously you've got the median pay, which you might be surprised to hear is around about 26, 27,000 in the UK at the moment. But so you've got some differences there. Okay, that's all fair enough. But what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add one more bit of average pay to the next chart that I put up. Okay? And so along the bottom here, there's going to be one more added in, and it's going to be the average pay of a FTSE 100 executive. Okay? I'm just going to drop that into the chart. Now, question for both groups, how big is my chart going to need to be to get that on? Yeah? Is it going to be over here somewhere? Is it going to be halfway across the car park? Where is it going to be, do you think? Now have that in your mind, don't need to tell me, because obviously I have to make it bigger. Does it need to be twice as big? 3 times as big? Just think to yourself what it is going to be. And here we go. Now, I'm interested at that reaction just then, because I've used this slide a couple of times, and people usually gasp. They know it's going to be big, they know it's going to be quite large, they know it's going to dwarf all the other salaries, but when it comes up they go, oh, that's what usually happens, yeah? And I did hear that a couple of times tonight, and I was pretty shocked. So, it's enormous, isn't it? Makes everything look absolutely minute. Now, if you haven't got overhead projector, and if you haven't got charts and everything else, I'll give you a little simple way if you ever want to pass this information on to somebody else, okay? And this is it. If you take a pen or a pencil, and you say to the person, that represents average pay. That represents average pay in the UK, 26, 27,000, something like that. How big would my pen need to be if I wanted to represent the average salary of a FTSE 100 executive? And they'll say, maybe that big. That's what I get, usually, about that big. 5.5 metres. My pen would have to be 5.5 metres tall. What's that, about there, maybe? Maybe there. Yeah, maybe there. To represent it. Okay. Okay, so we know there's a difference. So my next question, maybe your next question is, has it always been like this? Has there always been this much difference between 20% at the bottom and 20% at the top, or between FTSE executive pay and average pay? So, what you need to be able to work that out is something called the Gini coefficient. Gini, by the way, Steve, was the name of the guy who invented it, Italian guy, G-I-N-I. It's been around for about 100 years, this method of working things out. So it's been around a while, but this particular chart uses the Gini coefficient in order to measure inequality, really. That's how it works, okay? And obviously on here, we've got, on this particular chart, it runs through from 1977 up to 2011-12. And you can see, look, that in 1977, the gap, don't worry about the numbers again, but the gap was lower than it was later on. And between 1977, there was a bit of climbing that went on, up to around about 1990. And so between 77 and 90, the Gini coefficient shows that the income inequality gap grew enormously. No prizes for guessing who was Prime Minister during that period of time. Now, since then, of course, it's gone up and down, it's bounced up and down a bit, but it hasn't come back down. It's stayed quite high since then. Now, it looks as if, here, it looks as if it's closing a bit. And there are some people who will try to say, yes, things are getting a lot better and the income inequality gap is closing. Now, I'll have something to say about that a little bit later on. But it's still quite high. Now, the other thing that I thought at this stage was, well, can we go back, can we dig a little bit deeper, and can we see whether it's been like this before 1977? Now, this is a bit different. Remember, you were the top 20%, okay? Top 10%, so about here. All right, so we're just looking at the top 10% now on this chart, okay? There is the top 0.1, that's Steve, but top 10. So what we're looking at here, top 10% and dates. Now we go back just over 100 years, and the top 10% took 47% of the total sum of money received. And that's more than just salaries, of course, that's all income, whether it was from rents or shares or whatever it was. But, so in 1911, 47% was taken by the top 10%. And then it started to fall. So, around about the 1960s, 70s, it dropped, so the top 10% only took 29% of the wealth. So that was roughly where our previous chart started. But then, of course, as we know, it climbed again. And so 2009 is our last number on here. My guess is if we had 2014, it will be similar, but I haven't got that figure because they're not available. But it's come back up again. So it started off quite high, it fell, and it's come back up. So we've got inequality now in terms of the top 10% that is similar to the 1920s. That's where we are. The other thing about this chart is that you can see that throughout this early part of the 20th century, there were two significant events, and they actually helped to close the inequality gap. The two world wars helped to close the inequality gap throughout that period of time. They actually contributed to that. And there is a more recent book, which I haven't read yet, I don't know whether anybody's come across it, by a guy called Thomas Piketty. Anybody heard about that? Big volume, apparently. And his book is called Capital in the 21st Century. And basically, his argument is that capitalism has failed. That's his argument. Apparently, it's the best-selling book in the US at the moment. It's outselling everything else because it's just such a wow read. He's saying that without the sort of the correction of the two world wars, that we wouldn't have had capitalism functioning anymore. The inequality would have been so great that the whole thing would have just imploded, and something would have had to happen by now. Okay, interesting point. So, the next question is, are things improving? Because one or two people will tell you that things are getting better. And there's a couple of things that I picked up which interested me really in relation to this. At the moment, 2,000 bankers in London being paid more than €1 million. Okay, what about this? Rich, expensive, productive Germany, which was something, what was it, 5.2 on my first chart, wasn't it? 1 to 5.2 in Germany. They only need 170 that are paid that much, but for some reason London alone needs 2,000. Thought that was quite interesting. And the other thing I thought was quite interesting was this one. Because again, that's a bit more recent, and it shows that even though perhaps total salaries might be going up slightly, and even though some people's average salaries might be going up slightly, people are having to work a lot harder for it because the hourly wage is actually going down. Okay, so we've got a few more interesting stats. The other thing that perhaps we need to do is to think about what's happening with all these cuts that are taking place. Yeah, and remember that we've got, where's my next chart gone? Spending cuts, and the spending cuts that are in process at the moment are locked in, aren't they? Whoever wins the election next year, they've said we're going to retain the spending cuts exactly as they are. Okay, and this is the impact. So where's our richest tenth gone? Here we go. Yeah, here's our richest tenth. Right? You're just about there. There you go. All the way around to there. Richest tenth. You're going to have to really worry because you're going to lose about 1.5% of your wealth over the next 2 or 3 years. And where's our poorest tenth? Poorest tenth. Just about here, aren't you? Your poorest tenth. Yeah. Sorry, you're going to have to lose about 20% of your wealth. There you go. So when people say the gap's narrowing, I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced by that, because there are one or two other factors that seem to come in that make a difference. I've seen the question asked that, does a tax cut for the poorest create an opportunity for employers to pay lower wages? I've seen that one as a headline. I've also seen a reverse Robin Hood effect, robbing the poor to pay the rich. I've seen that. But it certainly seems fairly obvious that the money that is used to sustain the top 10% over here, you can go boo at this point if you like, it's coming from you lot. You're paying them, There you go. Sorry about this. I said you were in the best part of the room. Okay. When Steve first asked me to do this talk, there was a working title which he gave me, and it was Equality Heals Life. That was the title in the email he sent me. He said, would you mind giving this talk? And this is the title I want you to work to. And that was fine until it changed. But what I thought was, if equality heals life, what's the opposite of healing? That's being wounded, isn't it? The opposite of healing. And so, are we wounded by inequality? Do you feel wounded now over here at this point? Yeah, do you feel as if it's their fault and they're wounding you? Okay, maybe. Bit of indulgence now. This, I took this photograph in 2008 in Cape Town. I was privileged, really, to be given the opportunity to establish a link between my own school at the time, which was Nova Heriot, and Harold Cressy High School in Cape Town. And one of the students at Harold Cressy High School lived here. This was her house. This was where she lived. What they call it in Cape Town is they call it an informal settlement. That's their term for something like this. Now, this is a quite well-established informal settlement, because what you can see here is... oh, rats. Sorry about that. Let's go back again. That was me pressing the wrong clicker. There we go. Try again. What you can see here, look, is electricity. So this informal settlement has got electricity. I was shown the most recent informal settlement, and it had nothing. It had a few bits of corrugated sheeting, but nothing else. No electricity, no water, no sanitation, nothing. That was one of the most depressing things I've seen in my life. But the reason I'm showing you this is because sometimes people say to me, there isn't any real poverty in the UK. You know, sometimes people say to me, no, that isn't the case. The UK is a rich country. You don't get those sort of problems. That's what I get. It's sort of the Edwina factor that sometimes happens. Anyway, what struck me was this. Now, this photograph appeared in the Daily Mail of all papers, and you may remember it. And what it shows is you've got a row of terraced houses there and a row of terraced houses here. And this is taken in Newham, London Borough of Newham. And then you've got this interesting shape here in red and white. And at first you look at them and you think, oh, that's the garages, yeah? But of course, you might be able to get into that one, and you might be able to get into that one, but you couldn't get into this one or this one with a car. Clearly that used to have a garage door, but you can't get anywhere. So what's going on, you think? What's happening? Well, what is happening is that this is an informal settlement, because this is where people lived. And there were people living in the houses here, 2 or 3 families in some cases, and families living here in converted garages. Now, they were informal because they weren't on anybody's radar. The council didn't know anything about them. Been no planning permission. Somebody had simply converted a garage into somewhere where a family could live. And the estimate at the time, which possibly has gone up since then, was that there were 55,000 people living in London like this, in informal settlements. No figures for the rest of the UK, just figures for London. Now we're into impact 1 here, housing. Impact 1 of inequality relates to housing. Just let you read this. So this is from Dorling, the book that I showed you, All That Is Solid. And what Dorling argues is that there is such a close relationship between income inequality and housing inequality, you can't separate them, you can't pull them apart, and it's difficult to know which came first. Okay, so what it'd be useful now to look at is, one of the things that people like, remember that first chart I put up, with the factors, and it was 1 to, how much was it, remember? In the UK, 1 to 7.2, yeah? Early on. And one of the questions I get asked is, Japan and the Scandinavian countries, how do they do that? How do they remain a little bit less unequal than the UK? Well, the answer is regulation. Japan does it by regulating salaries, and the Scandinavian countries do it by regulating through tax, basically. So it's regulation that happens. And so what has created this issue that we've got here? It's deregulation. That's the main culprit that has created this particular issue. Now, thought it'd be useful to just look at a few selective, if you like, selective issues related to housing. Found this one quite interesting. So go back 10 years, take your average salary, 9 months of that salary you could put down as a deposit. Now, you need 3 times. My guess is that just about wipes out most people that you know, really, in terms of being able to afford a mortgage. Because how many people can save 3 times their salary? This is an interesting one. I'll let you read it and then I will explain it. So what this is about is, let's say you see a house over here and you say, yeah, I like that. I want to buy that house. I can scrape together the mortgage, bank and mum and dad, whatever it is. I can get the deposit. And let's say that house is 150,000. Okay. So to buy that house over a 25 or 30 year period, it would cost the equivalent of 300,000. Yeah. Okay, it's going to be more than that because of inflation and everything else, but at today's prices, it's going to be the equivalent of 300,000. To rent that same house over a 25 or 30 year period, it would be 450,000. Yeah, that's what that's all about. And then, something I guess you know, we're not building social housing, not really, in any meaningful scale, and so that's a hell of a queue, isn't it? Hell of a queue. So we've got that, and then, of course, we've got some homeless people. The word that I find absolutely fascinating in here is that one. Registered homeless. So these are the people we know about. What about the people we don't know about? I don't know, I'm guessing, maybe 1 million in there, really. So those are some interesting, and I agree, selective facts. Okay, so we're still on Impact 1 at the moment. Oh yeah, just a little quote from Danny Dorling here, going back to the rental one. If tenants in the private rented market feel bled dry, they have a cause. Just a quote from Dorling. So we're still on Impact 1, remember, to do with housing. So if I haven't made my point up to now, let's just really hammer it home. So in amongst that 600,000, 75,000 children, which is a bit shocking, isn't it? This one, from Shelter, this relates to the mortgage interest rate, really, because what Shelter worked out was that, you know, if the mortgage interest rate goes up just by a tiny little bit, then all these people simply won't be able to afford their mortgage anymore. And when you hear, you know, just the other day, Mark Carney said, oh no, it's not quite time to put the mortgage interest rate up, didn't he? Yeah, he said, just the other day. The reason is, it's going to be very, very embarrassing. Mortgage interest up, people put out houses. It's going to happen. What else? Rough sleepers. And we haven't even talked about houses that aren't fit for purpose yet. You know, where there's overcrowding, temporary rundown. A lot of rental properties simply aren't being kept up to scratch in terms of quality. I was lucky to have a chat with the people that run Swindon Food Bank fairly recently, and they were telling me that they look after 6,000 people a year in Swindon at the moment. It's gone up 20% year on year over the last few years. So, if I go back to that earlier slide, which seemed to show that things were getting better, I don't believe it, is my point. I don't think they are getting better necessarily. If anything, I think they're getting worse. Okay. Oh yes. Recovering economy. You see signs about recovering economy. You see information about unemployment stats coming down and so on. But in amongst those employment stats, you've got 1.4 million people on 0 hours contracts. 1.4 million people on 0 hours contracts. Okay. So, moving on to Impact 2 now, which I said was going to be health. Just let you read this one. So, the people over here are living in a different world, aren't they? Yeah, 10 or 20% different world. And they don't realise what it's like for people over here. That's the point. That isn't Angus Dayton, who used to chair of I Got News for You, by the way. He's a different one. Princeton. So, moving on to this then. Now, what we've got here is a chart, and because it's a little bit on the complicated side, we've got something for you to scribble on so that you can hopefully understand it. It's a big group here, so there should be one each there. And there should be one each there. And there are pens on the table. Okay. How are we doing? I've run out of microphone. I'm just going to put that down a minute. There we go. You're going to have to join a group. Come on, join a group and get a chart. And sit at the back. Move up. Spare charts on the table. Okay, everybody got a chart. There's two sides to this. We're looking at the one that says health and social problems are worse in more unequal countries. That's the one we're looking at first, okay? Which is the one I've got up on the screen. Now, this is taken straight from the spirit level. So this is taken from here, Wilkinson and Pickett. So I'm acknowledging my source. And what Wilkinson and Pickett did, they took information that was available, nationally and internationally available statistics, related to a whole range of different issues, and these are the health and social issues. You can see them in the index. Okay, so I say do scribble all over these bits of paper so that you understand. It took me a couple of nights to get my head around this when I first saw it. So they took information related to that, and then they plotted it against the income inequality that we already now know exists within the UK. Okay? And so what you've got on this chart are all the bits of information put together from all these different health and social issues. So they've been amalgamated. In the book, there are separate charts for every single one, as well as this one. Yeah? We know already that we've got income inequality, and we know that the USA and the UK are at the wrong end of that income inequality scale. Yeah? And we know that Japan and the Scandinavian countries are at the, what should we say, the better end, the less unequal end of that. And then you plot it against these health and social problems up here, and what do you get? You get a frightening correlation between the two. So what you get is countries that are more unequal have greater health and social problems. Countries that are more equal or less unequal have fewer health and social problems. And that works with all of these. Whichever one of those you take, it works. And on all of the individual charts, the USA and the UK are at the wrong end. And Japan and the Scandinavian countries are at the right end, if you like. That was one of the staggering things about the spirit level, and that was why it became such a profound book. And nobody's been able to refute it. Several people have tried over the last 4 or 5 years. Nobody's been able to refute it because they've simply taken stats that exist at the moment. So, you've got the UK, the third worst of these 22 developed countries. There's only one conclusion, really, from this. Conclusion is inequality is bad for your health. That's the conclusion. And it isn't just bad for you guys over here. It's bad for you guys over here as well. Even when you take the stats for rich people, they still end up at the wrong end of the scale. Rich people in more equal countries do better in terms of health and social issues. So inequality is bad for everybody, all the time. That's the conclusion. The other thing that people ask sometimes as well, and this is the chart on the other side of the page, so just flip it over. And so what people say is, well, what about if average income improves? What about if we work hard and we push up people's average income? Surely that's going to help. Surely that's going to make things better. No, it doesn't. Because what you've got here, look, you've got USA, highest average income in the world, worse health and social problems in the world. UK, look at that, level with, what have we got? Finland and Sweden and Belgium in terms of average income, but we have much greater health and social problems than any of those countries. So just by pushing up the average income doesn't help, doesn't make a difference. You still have health and social problems that create issues. Okay. This one's going to speak for itself as well. I'll just let you absorb it as I go through. Read about those all the time, haven't we? Yeah? We've read about them. Okay. What I also wanted to do was just try and get some other issues related to health. And this one comes from Office for National Statistics. So this is the government-owned information, 2013, related to 2011, because again, there's always a delay on getting stats out and so on. And that's what we are saying, you know. So a big jump in those of us that are saying our general health isn't very good. This was quite interesting. So 12,000 increase, 2.6% increase. A big jump again, biggest in 17 years. And many of them elderly women. What's interesting is you can't get that stat anymore. They've stopped producing it. I wonder why. I did see a report that linked that, put those two things together. No way of proving it, but it was an interesting report. That they're saying there was a sort of a housing related issue at the back of that. Can't prove that one either way. But this is more current stuff. Yeah.
Got any stats from the recent release of stats for Greece and the impact of austerity measures on health there?
I haven't got any stats here on slide. I have read some information, not just Greece, but Spain and Portugal as well. There's a whole lot of information coming out in relation to austerity and how that's impacting on those groups. You're right, there's information available on that. Yeah, I remember reading that. So, in summary, at this point, we've got greater income inequality than most other developed countries, and we can see impacts on housing and on health. Okay? Now, the authors I've mentioned and other authors like Will Hutton have come up with all sorts of suggestions about ways to improve the UK, the way that we can actually go about improving things. And obviously we haven't got a great deal of time to look at the why and the how these things have developed. But I wanted to put up some ideas, and I've deliberately put them together as a word cloud so that they're not that clear. And your favourite one might be there or it might not. So I'm sure you've got some ideas in your own mind as to why this has happened and how this has happened. And there's a few possibilities there. Like I say, it's just a quick glance, because we haven't really got time to go into it. But what I want to do is be a little bit selective and have a look at some UK issues, if you like. That's one of the issues, land ownership. Now, we're probably all aware of great big parcels of land in Scotland, for example, that are owned. Somebody was trying to sell a mountain the other day in the Peak District, I think, weren't they? Own a mountain, that's incredible, isn't it? But 69% of the land. Now, this isn't just rich people in big houses with lots of acreage. This includes builders. This includes the big building companies that are sitting on parcels of land with planning permission to build, but they're not building. Why they're not building? Because they feel the economy is so weak at the moment, they're not going to get a good return. This is the land that Ed Miliband was talking about taking back, compulsory purchasing. So that's one of the issues that does have an impact. That's interesting as well. Getting on for 1 million empty homes in the UK. Now that would include a whole range of different types of homes. That would include oligarchs buying London properties as investments and other people buying investments. That would include people having 2 or 3 homes. That would also include landlords just buying houses and leaving them empty and waiting again for the economy to pick up so they can charge a higher rent. It used to be the case that landlords had to do something with an empty house within 6 months. They could only hang on to it for 6 months, but now they can hang on to it for 2 years without doing anything at all with it. So, empty homes. And that means there's a lot of empty bedrooms as well. Dorling points out there are more bedrooms in the UK than there are people. We've never had as many bedrooms in the UK than we have at the moment, It's just that a lot of them are empty. And that isn't obviously an issue related to somebody with a tiny bedroom about the size of this table that they have to, either pay extra for or get out. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with empty houses, basically. Landlords and the rich are allowed to own several properties all at once. Okay, next one. That was the famous right to buy scheme, which mainly occurred during that period where, remember the Gini coefficient one, where it went psst, like that? Yeah. But what's happened to them? Over half of those houses are now owned by landlords. So they're being rented out. 1.5 million being rented out. So that's another issue, I think, that has an impact. This is the cynic in me that wanted to put this one up. And it makes you wonder what sort of impact we can have, doesn't it? When you've got all of that going on, people in a position to be able to influence what policymakers do and say. Just a little bit of influence there. Laws being framed to help the rich. What's that phrase? Sometimes the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Sometimes the rich get richer and the poor stay the same. Yeah, that one? You wonder why, don't you? Now, I think this is interesting as well, because this almost says, well, actually, we get the politicians we deserve, I think, that one. And what's going to happen on Thursday? Who's going to be the biggest winner on Thursday? The stay-at-home party. 65% of people won't vote on Thursday. That's the winner, isn't it? So, sometimes some people could say, well, do we care if that's happening? Okay, so they're just a few issues that I've picked out. Now, what could the UK do to fix inequality? Now, I am conscious that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here because I'm simply referring to these people and what they are suggesting. So this isn't me, this is them. And that's one thing that is suggested. Let's have a bit of regulation. Because countries that have regulation tend to be more equal or less unequal. Since the crash of 2008, what have we had? We've had weak, fairly toothless laws that have been introduced, and they've been introduced very slowly. And if you want to know more about that, then read Wilkes. He's very good on that. He's also very good on this issue as well, competition laws and corporate governance and bankruptcy laws, and so is Stiglitz, who I mentioned, where Price of Inequality, that one. So read him. Capping corporate pay, that's again Hutton and Stiglitz. Rent controls, there was a big outcry, wasn't there, just a few weeks ago when there was a mention of rent controls, Stalinist and all the rest of it. There are countries right across Europe that have rent controls and always have had. And that's how they tend to hold rents down. But Danny Dorling for that one. And then tax reform, ensuring people actually pay their taxes, of course. That's one of the things. But also there's a whole load of issues related to different types of taxation. For example, where are our rich people? Okay, so your house is worth about £1 million, yeah? And your house is worth about £10 million, and you pay the same tax. That's great, isn't it? So one of the things Dorling suggests is that it's about time we had tax bands above band H for all those more expensive properties, for example. And what's the last one? Okay, small L, of course, Labour's bargaining power. So this is to do with things like union membership and collective bargaining and worker representation on boards and those sort of things. You know, the fact that the labour market is too flexible now. Yeah, it's gone beyond where it needs to be to make things work. And that list isn't exhaustive, of course. That's just, again, selected highlights, my selected highlights, if you like. Examples of what could be done. And I mentioned Thomas Piketty earlier on, and he talks about a global wealth tax to try and balance things out. And we have choices. We do have choices. I'll let you read those. And I know which end I'd prefer to be on that one. So, I'm conscious that there's been a sort of a lowering of the collective empowerment in the room, you know, because this sort of stuff makes me feel disempowered. It makes me feel, you know, about that big and what the heck could I do? But I think there are some things that we can do to make things less unequal. Your objective 4 turns you into a pressure group. Steve mentioned Swindon Equality Group, which is the group that I belong to, and Annie belongs to, and Steve now belongs to. And this grew out of the Spirit level, a national group called the Equality Trust set up in London and said, like, we want local groups working on local issues. And so we established this group about a year ago. And we decided that we were going to focus on the living wage. And we've been part of the group lobbying Swindon Borough Council to pay the living wage, for example. That's one of the things that we've been working on. So, supporting pressure groups. How many people here use 38 degrees? Brilliant. If you don't know about 38 degrees, have a look at it. I'll put the web address up later on the next slide. And then there are others like that, some of us in my society, and this is where you can contribute. You can add your signature to a list. And I find it actually quite empowering when I add my signature and the list is on about 10,000, and then the next day I go in and it's on about 150. That's great, isn't it? You see that? And then it goes above a certain amount, and it has to be raised in Parliament, and above a certain amount, and things start to happen. And there have been successes, huge successes, from 38 degrees. Jeremy Hunt absolutely hates 38 degrees, I'm sure. So it's possible to get involved in those. I'm not sure who it was, Steve, that said to us the other day, local councillors sitting in a room and nobody came along to their surgery. Was it one of your friends, I think, which is quite interesting, wasn't it, you know? Actually go to the local councillors and say, what are you doing? And I'll give you some of our literature in a minute, but we've got some questions for local councillors prior to the election, which you can have a look at in just a minute as well. So I think that's something that can be done. And if you are a shareholder, then you've probably seen that some shareholders have become revolting, haven't they, in the recent past, and they've said no to bonuses. Sometimes not enough of them have said no, but at least it's making waves, isn't it? There's been some sort of progress on that one. And this one, my family hate me actually, because there are so many things that we can't use now and things that we can't do, especially at Easter time. You know, my grandchildren think it's hilarious that I won't touch Cadbury's, you know, and various other things. If you want to know my long list of companies that I won't use and why, I'll tell you afterwards. I won't bore you with that list now, but just stop using them. You know, it had an impact, didn't it, with a certain coffee company, made a difference to what they did. And then there's this aspect. There's actually talking about it, or even shouting about it. And I think you are in a very good position to be able to talk about it. And I've just got one paragraph from the spirit level, which I want to finish on, and then I'll just hand out some leaflets and then take any questions. Okay, here we go. The initial task, this is Wilkinson and Pickett from the spirit level. The initial task is to gain a widespread public understanding of what is at stake. But rather than allowing this to be just one more idea that briefly gains attention before fashionable opinion moves on, we need to build a social movement committed to its realization. It must be taken up and pursued by a network of equality groups, meeting to share ideas and action everywhere, in homes and offices, in trade unions and political parties, in churches and schools. It needs also to be pursued by the pressure groups, charities and services concerned with the various issues which are related to equality, whether health or teenage births, prison populations or mental health, drugs or education standards, and we can now add housing to that list as well. And they need to be coupled with the urgent task of dealing with global warming. What was that? An area the size of France coming out of the Antarctic over the next few years? In all these settings, we must speak out and explain the advantages of a more equal society. Thanks very much.